Have Arsenal officially left behind Tottenham? Because only a year ago, both teams were fighting at the top of the table, both unbeaten, and it was Spurs who led the league by 2 points. But fast forward to today, after this week's derby, it looks as though the gap in North London is as big as ever. So using this graphic at the bottom of the screen and the tactics board, I'm going to answer the question, are the two clubs as far apart as they seem? Or was what happened a year ago a teaser as to what might be happening very soon? So this graphic is going to represent the gap seemingly between the two North London clubs, but I want you to keep a close eye on it throughout the video, as each tactical point I make, the gap will fluctuate, with the teams growing either further apart or closer than we ever thought. So we're going to start with the build-up, as it shows the initial game plan and how both teams want to transition into those attacking moments. And the first thing we see with Arsenal's build-up is the big gaps that they have between the 7 players here to create those angles, create those distances, making it difficult for Tottenham to cover that amount of ground and press an individual player. The two centre-backs would split either side of the 18-yard box, creating this wide U initial shape here, but the two sixes are almost the most important players in this build-up, as they become very flexible, malleable to create angles and passing options for either player in this initial 5 to help build through the third. They may drop to offer a passing option for their goalkeeper and then pass it to their centre-back, who could then drive through the third. The ball might come to the full-back and the 6's job would to come close and again offer that passing option to a centre-back who can drive through. Or they might receive the ball initially from the goalkeeper and try and play to the other side, trying to switch the press from left to right. And Tottenham wanted to deal with these two 6's in a very specific way. What we saw from Spurs was their almost infamous high line that we've seen throughout Ange's time, this lone 6, but I wanted to focus on these 5 players here. Firstly, with Dom Solanke. It was Solanke's job to deal with these big spaces in Arsenal's build-up created by that U, but he was to direct the press of Tottenham, force Arsenal onto one side of the pitch, as it's very difficult to press an entire 11-man team in one pitch. So you try and force the ball one side so that you can trap the ball and win it back. And it was Solanke's job to do so. He'd stop that ball going into the centre-back here, force Raya to play this ball into the opposite centre-back in Saliba, and then these 4 players come into the game plan. These 8s here in Maddison and Kulusevski were often very tight to the 6's, almost making that ball into the middle of the park impossible. But what was important is they'd start almost just a yard or 2 away, baiting that pass here so that they could win it centrally here. Or if this centre-back did stutter, took his time, they could press this 6, then carry on that pressure to the centre-back, and that's where Spurs would shift their press, lock onto one side of the pitch. Solanke would stop that ball being played back to the goalkeeper. Son Heung-min pressuring the fullback here, stopping that ball going wide, and then this 6 would jump, and suddenly Tottenham now have locked onto one side of the pitch and tried to trap this ball on this right-hand side. And they actually created a big opportunity for Solanke doing exactly this, where the ball broke with Son Heung-min. It landed at Solanke and he just couldn't get his finish off in time, and Saliba blocked it. But it was the principle of this narrow force stopping that initial pass into the central areas, and these jumping 8s from the 6 to the centre-back so that they could lock on high up the pitch and win those high turnovers. So what about Arsenal? Were they as successful at winning the ball back high up the pitch? Well, to understand this, we need to see how Tottenham wanted to build up. And what Ange has utilised throughout his time at Spurs is something I like to call the star, with the fullbacks not high and wide as we've seen with Arsenal, but actually they'd come very narrow with this centerpiece 6 here, creating what I like to call the star, or you can call it the box with this central 6. And it becomes a very narrow shape for Tottenham, who want to build up in the center of the park. We see with Ange with these short passing distances here, trying to build through the center of the park initially and then out to the wide players as they progress up the pitch. So it allowed for Arsenal to actually be quite compact in the center of the pitch. These 2 wide players could lock on on to these fullbacks here. And it was these two, Trossard and Havertz, who were having to manage the distances between these four players, including the goalkeeper. They'd have to push when they believed that they could stop these balls going into the centre-back, force this ball centrally into the six, and it was Jorginho's job to then jump and win that ball off Bentancur. It was this distance management that was constantly happening with Arsenal. It's something that they've improved on and built into their game. How can we jump into different parts of the pitch successfully? And it's not only about the timing, it's about how close are you initially to that next line of pressure. Once these jump, if Jorginho is sat almost creating a back five here, sat too deep, he's never going to make that run here. Or if he's too tight, there's a potential for this fullback here to drag, and suddenly we're creating all sorts of mess in the centre of the park. It's about managing these distances correctly, and at times Arsenal weren't. But the positive for Arsenal was if they couldn't quite time it correctly and Jorginho couldn't arrive at that duel in the correct moment, and that ball did break to a centre-back, it meant that Arsenal hadn't committed too many bodies. So if the ball did break and Tottenham could progress in wide areas, it meant that Arsenal was still compact and could drop into their 4-4-2 without having to sort of shift over or run back. They'd allowed for their structures to still stay in place due to committing minimal bodies, almost coaching distance management to such a high level that they could win the ball back with less bodies, so that if it didn't go well, if they couldn't win that ball back, they still had that structured 4-4-2. And this led to Spurs having a lot of possession in Arsenal's final third. So to the naked eye, Tottenham are progressing the ball better. They're having more possession higher up the pitch. It seems as though they were having a far better game than Arsenal. But this leads me to two very important words. I'm not going to tell you them just yet, but it separates the two teams entirely. So when Spurs did have possession in this part of the pitch, they'd end up in a sort of 2-3-5 formation. But the importance of these positions are two specific things. The first is creating 3v2 scenarios in wide areas, specifically with these three players here. With this 8, who often wasn't an 8, it was a Kulusevski or an Udogie operating in the half space, a Porro or a Maddison operating on the outside of the block, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and these wide players in Johnson and Son. And what they try and do is try and attract this pressure, again, narrow into the centre of the pitch, try and drag this fullback into the half space with this 8. A Martinelli or a Saka try and press this player that's jumped outside of the block, leaving this fullback to be alone in wide areas, who then isolate his fullback here, create all sorts of problems in wide areas, get the ball into the box. It was these 2v3 scenarios that Spurs were constantly trying to create, and they did so using the second specific part of this 2-3-5 formation, and it was specifically these two players here in Maddison and Porro. See, Maddison, as we know, is the most creative, technical player that Spurs have, and usually the most nimble technical midfielder operates in these half spaces, but oftentimes Maddison was starting inside the block being Arsenal's, structured formation blocking this centre part of the pitch, and come outside of it, either attracting pressure to open up holes in Arsenal's shape, or if not, he could receive the ball in lots of time and space that could allow him to dictate play, again, outside of Arsenal's shape. Everything I've said up until now suggests that Tottenham are a well-coached team that aren't that far away from Arsenal, with brilliant technical players like Maddison operating in and outside of the block to break down structured shapes, deadly wingers isolating their fullbacks to create goal-scoring opportunities, a smart striker dictating the press to win the ball back up high up the pitch. It suggests that Tottenham aren't that far away from their North London rivals. But the problem is the culture, the football that Ange is building at Spurs is something called idealistic football. It works on the tactics board. I can explain it beautifully as to how all of these different cogs work seamlessly, and at times it can be great to watch. But the problem is they're up against another team in North London that are playing realistic football. The difference between idealistic and realistic football can be explained exactly where we were before. Arsenal, and specifically Mikel Arteta, has coached a genuinely amazing 4-4-2 block. He has wingers that are willing to drop into a back six to occupy the wide players to allow the fullbacks to be touch tight to those eight. He has an incredibly patient front two that are willing to shift up and down horizontally to stop these technical players playing outside of the block. He has two centre backs who are monsters and some of the best box defenders I've seen in the Premier League. This is realistic football. It's a meme that Mikel Arteta uses 4 centre backs and buys anyone that's over 6'3", but it's about what football is going to win on the pitch, not on the tactics board. Arsenal have a team full of physical monsters that are going to win the battles on the pitch, that are going to defend their box valiantly because they have such belief in this structure, and more importantly, such belief in their attacking play that they can sit patiently in incredibly coached 4-4-2 low block because they believe that they can affect the opposition's goal so effectively. And even more importantly, this can be shown through their results this season. Arsenal have gotten through tricky games versus Brighton and Aston Villa when they've not been at their best, but Spurs have dominated teams like Leicester and Newcastle but been on the receiving end of a draw and a loss because the philosophy behind the football isn't there to win the games. Arsenal's football allows for the floor to be raised even when they're not hitting the ceiling, where it feels like Ange's football needs the perfect conditions for it to work. In order for Spurs to close that gap on Arsenal, they need to create a physical team that can work in any condition, because that is exactly what Mikel Arteta has built. And that is why the two North London clubs are considerably more far apart than it looks like on the pitch. And if Spurs aren't careful, then they're going to be left behind forever by their neighbours, because idealistic football will always be beaten by realistic football.